Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore.
I'm Carolyn Swift, the retired curator at the Capitola Museum, and I'm here today with the Capitola Memories Project, and it is my great privilege to be talking with Diane Porter Cooley, a member of the Porter family that first came to SoCal in the early 1850s and has since helped shape the character and the growth of much of Santa Cruz County and Monterey County, this region, and a great deal of California. So, hello Diane, thank you for talking with me today, and why don't we start with some of your memories of growing up in the Pajaro Valley and what it felt like to be a Porter growing up in Watsonville and Pajaro, and also how you grew up to have a love of horses and agriculture and farming and got interested in the things you are.
The latter is the interest in the valley, the horses, and the farming certainly were part of my development far before any concept of what it meant to, quote, be a Porter. I was just trying to find out what it meant to be a little girl living on a ranch in the country, and that was plenty exciting enough for me, and still is. I've come around full circle, and here I am, moved back again to this beautiful place, having lived lots of other interesting places, but none that I love anymore. I think that I grew up caring deeply about the place that I lived. I cared about waking up in the morning and hearing the gulping of the whirling blades of the pump that we had a windmill, and I remember lying as a tiny girl seeing the patterns of light on the ceiling and hearing the gulps of water. I think I was so little that I could barely drag myself up on my crib bars and want to go out and explore all that, and hearing birds at Elkhorn Slough. We lived on the bank of Elkhorn Slough. The Elkhorn Slough is sort of the archetypal birthing ground of much of the animal life in this area, as has the Pajaro Valley been. The marshes is where it all began, and so it certainly did with me.
You were born in Watsonville?
No, I was not. My mother's family were from Berkeley, and at that time there was no hospital in Watsonville. People were born at home, and my parents lived quite far out in the country, just the two of them, so there was no at home for them to go to, although my great-grandmother lived in it, to me later, huge house in Pajaro. But my grandmother, my mother's mother and father, lived in Berkeley, and her obstetric doctor and a good hospital were there. So I went home to my grandmother's house, my mother did. I was born there in the Peralta Hospital, and then after, I guess, 2 weeks or something, brought down home again. And my life was really deeply affected by both my wonderful upbringing in the natural world of the Pajaro Valley, and later with friendships and relatives, but my very significant relationship with the San Francisco Bay Area through my grandparents and my great aunt who lived in Berkeley and San Francisco. So I'm a kind of a by the bay girl.
So you've had connections with the Pajaro Valley and the Bay Area your whole life?
Yes,
Well,
happily.
tell it. Where did you go to school? And you graduated from Watsonville High.
I am a happy wildcat from the Watsonville High School, class of 46. There was a controversy because I lived in Monterey County, in North Monterey County, which meant that I should go to school there. And I guess ultimately I could go, we all went to Watsonville High. There was an arrangement then, and the people who lived in North Monterey County and in Pomeroy. And then what became Los Lomas, which was our ranch name, Los Lomas, was developed, and that's a story. But I went to school in Watsonville, and when I was in the first grade, I was driven to school so that I could go to school in Watsonville knowing that I would be part of that cadre of students and I wouldn't be educated with a different group that might go off to Monterey or Salinas or wherever.
So you grew up with classmates you knew?
I grew up in the big city. My social development was in the big city of Watsonville. My personal development was at home on the ranch and with the things that I love to be with, which is the natural world.
Now, were you aware of your family, the Porter family's history?
Never.
As a child, you didn't know?
No. My father said, I hear too much about Porter all my life. Just forget it. You just be your own self and make your own friends. And if there are people in the family you like, good for you. Lucky.
But did you know about John T. and Fanny?
I heard legends as time went on. I had very legendary background from my maternal grandparents too, both because of the Civil War and because of the Indian Wars, which those families, the Owsleys and the Huggins, were very deeply engaged. And I heard really more from my grandmothers, my non-Porter grandmothers, than I did the Porters. The first time I ever saw my name in print was when they developed Pomeroy and did a little cut across from the corner that used to be between Salinas Road. And they cut it across and called it Porter Drive, and I couldn't figure out why they would call it Porter Drive. I knew my name was Porter.
But you didn't?
But I didn't get it, that any of that was property that had belonged to the family.
So you really were raised without a real clear view of where your family had fit in Santa Cruz County history.
And Monterey County history.
Absolutely.
But I am a history buff. I'm very engaged and interested in local history, and I think part of that was digging out my own and finding how deep it's and widespread the roots were here, and being happy to learn about the redwoods and the impact of the family on that, and the railroad, and all these things came to light through my own historic interest. I started becoming aware of the pieces of history by meeting the people who are part of those pieces. And that's always been, to me, the most interesting and relevant, immediately relevant ways of learning history, is to know my Uncle Ed, my Uncle John Porter, who was my father's older brother, a great raconteur. And he told everything in a way that made it seem much more fascinating and humorous. And my Uncle Ed was very interested in family history. And my father was the one who said, enough of that.
So he wasn't...
Yeah. However, I was what I loved best about my history as a little girl was the fact that I was a part of the land. I was a part of Elkhorn Slough. My history was the history of Slough. My history was the history of the hills. My history was the history of the redwood trees and of the cattle ranches and all the things that interested me.
When you told me once that when you were in high school you wanted to major in farm agriculture
Yes.
and they discouraged you. Is that true?
Oh, they not only discouraged me, they said it would be impossible because girls were not allowed to cross East Beach. East Beach is the high school is on East Beach, right?
Right.
And on the other side of the high school at that time, near where Martinelli's is still,
Mm-hmm.
were the shops, which were where boys could take machine shop and manual training and agriculture. And girls couldn't go there. On that same line, I wanted to go to Davis. And when I went to be interviewed at Davis, because I applied as a transfer, and transfers had to be interviewed. I had been to Stanford for 2 years, which I loved. I loved everything about Stanford. But I thought, it's time to get serious. If what I want to do is be a rancher, I better go to school and learn more about the technical and academic aspects of it. And they said, well, I'm sorry, but we don't accept women in the School of Agriculture, except we will accept you if you want to be in domestic, domestic science. And I said, I don't have any interest in that other than making a sandwich now and then. And but I said my father and my uncle both went to Davis, and at that time they didn't graduate people with a Bachelor of Science degree from Davis. It was a technical or trade school. And so they went on to Berkeley, and they both graduated from Berkeley, and I'd be glad to do that. Or, if you give me this training, maybe I can go back and graduate from Stanford. I did not do badly at Stanford. I had a quite good academic record there. And so I said, I just want to have this training. No, I'm sorry. They said it would be too distracting to have a woman in these classes.
So what did you do?
So I said, well, I'm certainly sorry, because I'd certainly like to know what I have to know, because I'm going to be in charge of an agricultural property. And they sort of shrugged, and I went back to Stanford, had a marvelous time, majored in history, and here I am today.
And you had a really interesting roommate, right?
Well, I had all my roommates are interesting, or I wouldn't have chosen them for roommates. It was fun for me because I am quite a social person. I like to be with people, and I never met somebody that I couldn't find a way of liking, at least for long enough to make it through the next hour or so. So the fact that we had eclectic roommates was fine, and I loved all mine. All of the girls in our corridor at Branner Hall at Stanford, I say Branner Hall because we were the out-of-town girls there.
I see.
And the country girls. And we call them P girls, were in Robley, which was the traditional hall for freshman women. I call them the P girls because they were all from Piedmont or Pasadena or maybe the Peninsula. Well, we had a lot more fun, and our GPAs were usually higher than all the P girls who had gone to wonderful schools, and they were much better read in literature than any of us. But we knew we knew how many nickels to make a quarter.
Did you Did you take history classes when you were at Stanford?
Absolutely.
So did you?
Every chance I could get. I took Soc and Psych, which are as phony as can be as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you either like people and get along, and that you can figure out on yourself. I don't need to read all those treatises about some Midwestern town. They were teaching everything from a context that was totally, had nothing to do with the reality of my life. They taught from, I mean, the only people they ever referred to in all the literature that we were reading at the time were Anglos. Well, all my friends were Chinese and Japanese, not too many Mexicans, there weren't too many there, lots of Slavonians, which we were, you know, and Italians. We were happily a great mixture who did not ever hesitate to know where everybody was from, and they knew, you know, it's Watsonville. The one thing that we knew is that we all went to Watsonville High.
So, you went to Stanford and then you married and then...
No, not quickly as that.
Did you
and
come
going
back?
to Stanford was so much fun in that era, too. One of the things that was wonderful about it was that everybody went to football games. A great deal was made about bonding and being part of the group. There were no sororities at Stanford. It was enough if you were a Stanford woman, and that's the truth. Outstanding group. You were asking about my roommates, and they were from, and my corridor mates, they were from Boston and New York and Arizona, as well as Southern California, like Bel Air. Whoever knew there was such a place, such a very elegant and glamorous places that in Southern California. I mean, I thought San Luis Obispo was about it for Southern California.
That's me too.
So this was great fun. And all of my friends there have gone on to be quite distinguished teachers and authors and artists, and one Supreme Court justice. And she and I were the kind of the also-rans, we thought maybe at first, because the other girls all came from towns, I mean big towns. And she was from, well, she'd gone to school in El Paso because there was no high school within a 4-hour drive of the Lazy Bee Ranch. So Sandra O'Connor and I had a ranching background that we could share with each other. And also she was fun and smart.
Did she?
And she still is.
Did she come visit you at Los Lobos?
Yeah. The people who came to visit me the most were the girls from Boston and New York, because it was before flying was so easy and accessible. So that mostly the girls who came from the East Coast came out by train, and then they stayed till Christmas break, which was a long enough span of time, 2 or 3 weeks, so that they could spare 3 days each way to go back and forth in the train. We all envied them so, because they had wonderful parties all the way back and forth and picked up really cute guys. So, you know, that was one of the best things I thought was possible about going to school in the East, and it made me want to go to school in the East.
Your family was initially from New Hampshire and Massachusetts?
Well, they were from New Hampshire. Of course, everybody was from Massachusetts before they moved to New Hampshire after they landed. You know, they landed pretty early, my family did, in the Massachusetts area, and then moved to New Hampshire a generation or 2 later, you know, to look for more land to farm. And then they found out that farming in New Hampshire was really not the way to make a living, and they went to, education was always very important to them, and they went to Dartmouth, and my great-great-grandfather, I guess it was, went to Dartmouth where his best friend was, and became a doctor, Dr. John Porter. And he became a doctor, I think, not because he had some sort of Peace Corps-like mission to go out and could bring health to people. It was because he had to earn a living somewhere except on the land. And so his buddy in school and he went, after Dartmouth, went over and to seek their fortunes south of Boston, back near Plymouth again. And his buddy's name was Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster became a very prominent member of Congress, author of significant bills, and the teeter-totter between the North and South interests. He had a lot of weight to throw in that. But at any rate, his buddy John, and he settled in the same community, and Daniel had a ward, one of his clients' young daughter. The clients died and they left this young woman in Daniel's care. And one of the things that you did, if somebody left you a young girl and she didn't end up working in an inn, I mean, there were not a lot of reasonable jobs for women at all in that time. You either married or or you were a scullery maid. But his responsibility was to find a suitable husband for his wife, Ward, and he felt that who could be more suitable than his buddy, and Thomas, whose father was a shipping family in Boston, and that was pretty significant in Boston in that era. So Anne, the Ward, was married to John, the doctor, and that's really the foundational group that I'm most aware of. And they had quite a few children, several sons, 5 or 6, I think. Anyway, all the Porters came west.
And the interesting and probably one of the more difficult, intricate parts of the story is there were these brothers and cousins.
Yes.
And mostly boys, and there was one girl.
Well, boys are the ones that could leave home and go out and do something.
But they were kind of teenagers. I think the first one to come was George, and he was 16.
Yeah.
16 or 17. So you have these teenagers right at the start of the gold rush who, you can just imagine them being infected with the desire to go west and test everything else. So how did they get to SoCal?
Well, young men were considered to be young men when they were about 16. It was time to get up and go, unless they wanted to stay and be in their father's business, which they didn't want to do, or be clerking for someone. And so John T. decided that he wanted to go, and his mother was very distressed at that and said, well, if you must go, let me make sure you go on a safe ship, because in that era, not everybody that went off from Boston to go to the gold rush got there. Ships were lost at sea a lot. And any of us who can trade, which is everybody that came to the United States, who got here is lucky not because of this glorious land that we share. They're lucky that they made land at all. There's not a lot written about all the people that didn't make it. So they signed themselves on as able-bodied seamen, at 16, and they're the jolly sailors that go skipping to the top. You needn't think that the old hardened sailors that they really need to sail the boat are going to do all the dangerous things. So these two boys somehow learned to do they knew to do what they were told. They were strapping boys, and they came to, according to the family legend, John T. sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge on the bark Herculaneum on New Year's Day of 1850, which means that I am not able to claim membership in the exclusive 49ers group. I don't mean the real.
You missed it by a day.
I missed it by a day. When they got to San Francisco, everybody on board, all the crew jumped ship and went off to the gold fields. And the only people left on board were these two boys who, through their mother, friend of family, arrangement, had been hired to be able to sail the boat there. And so they felt responsible to the captain, who had been their captain. And he had a very valuable cargo of household goods, shovels, I suppose, everything that you need in this new land. And it was no good on the boat, and there was nobody to unload it. So John and his pal made contact with the factors to whom it had been consigned, and unloaded the boat and got it to the people that were the middlemen for transporting it and selling it and so forth. And their diligence and honesty and physical capacity did not go unnoticed. So John was hired by the factors, they're called, and to take the cargo up to the mines and up to Sacramento and get it all through there for the people that owned the cargo, which was quite a responsibility for an 18-year-old, but he was, I guess, 6 feet or over and probably 180 pounds. I feature him as a pretty much fullback type guy.
Mm.
You know.
Well, now, George and John came, and who were the others that
I don't know all these brothers. They all the Porter men left home and
so
came
there
out
was
here.
their cousin Ben
Yes, wonderful Ben
and
George. They were close. Frequently the cousins were closer than the brothers because they were born over a long stretch of time, and you sort of hung out with your contemporaries.
no, Ben and George are the same age, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so and also you were sent back to the farm to learn how to work and to make you be happy to come back to the city again, I guess, and to be educated.
So in SoCal in the early 1850s, they all ended up there somehow.
Yes, because there was a store.
George.
The store was at the corner of Porter and SoCal.
And that was Ned's store.
Yeah, but it was never emphasized to me about whose store it was. It's the Porter store.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's sort of like most immigrants, well, I think the Chinese particularly are famous for this. Somebody in the family makes a little success, and that's like driving the stake in the ground. Then everybody comes there and works in the laundry for a while, or works at whatever it is to assemble their fortune or their stake, and then they go off and do something else.
So George, I think, by 1853 has got the tannery.
Yeah,
Where
I want to get us through this period of John T. taking the merchandise up to the hills.
Oh, okay.
this very young man, since there was no way for them to get their merchandise up to the cell in the mines, and they wanted to try to find a way, and he said, well, I can drive a team, I've been doing that, on the farm, and I can, so they loaded him up with the merchandise and sent him off on his way to Sacramento and up into the mines. And so he took charge. They gave him charge of these quite valuable cargoes to take up and distribute, sell, be the middleman, fulfill their obligations, and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's my understanding that is where he met Scott of Scotts Valley.
Scotts Valley.
So it's not just about Soquel, because I think it's Hiram Scott ran a ferry and a rooming house up near Stockton, which is where you have to cross all the marshes and everything, and you need to know somebody that will help you through all the shortcuts. And I think that's where the two of them became acquainted. And I'm mentioning it now because I've become interested in the relationship of Scott, and I'll tell you more about that later.
Oh, I think that's another part of the family.
It is.
It's another connection.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that I think the Porters were great connectors.
They certainly must have been.
Well, my family is sort of very gregarious, and we are interested in other people and want to maintain connections with the people that we like, and we like to be with them. And also you hopefully deal honestly with people and forthrightly. And there were a lot of scoundrels here during those glorious days.
But what brought John T. to Soquel?
Well, his brothers had come down here and started a store. And he came down to kind of get going, I understand, with them for a brief time.
Well, I think I've seen some letters where he comes down to advise them in getting the tannery going.
Well, that was after a while.
Yeah, about 1853, I think.
Yes, that's early enough. But since he was kind of on the verge of commercial entrepreneurship and teamstering, he knew what people needed. They needed boots, and they needed belts for running the mills and so forth, and they needed leather products, and he knew that was what they made. Much of that industry of New England was in fabricating leather in all sorts of ways. And I think he probably thought, well, why send the leather all the way from California back to New Hampshire to be made into a boot, and then send a boot all the way back to California again? So I think that, they were, all those New Englanders who came out here were not the calm guys that stayed home. They were the ones that could see and seize opportunity.
So John T. became the sheriff living in Soquel.
While he was sheriff, a young woman from Picton, Ontario, Canada, a very conservative young woman, very well educated for a young woman who had gone to convent schools there, although, as she said, I'm not of that persuasion, but I greatly admire the knowledge of the nuns who taught me, which means that she was an Anglican, not a Roman Catholic. But she liked the idea that women could be well educated and have a life beyond, and I'm sure through literature could be aware of the life that one could live beyond. And so she heard about her brother. Her name was Frances Cumming, Cumming. And her brothers had come out here in the gold rush. One of them fell very, very desperately ill, and they wrote back saying that he needed nursing. So she decided that she would drop everything and go out and nurse him to health. A very unusual thing for a young single woman of good background to decide that that's what she was going to do. But she did. She left. She went down the Ohio and the Missouri, the Ohio River and the Mississippi, and went to the Isthmus of Panama and crossed the isthmus on a mule, where at that point, if you could even make it, I mean, people were dying from yellow fever and every kind of terrible disease, typhoid, plus banditos who would say, follow me, I'll show you the shortcut, and it'd be the shortest cut you ever got.
That's right.
And so she managed, I think she chose her friends well, too, as all of us who have traveled alone now, anytime. You can kind of pick out somebody that you want to not necessarily become great friends with, but good for the trip.
Mm-hmm.
And so she made it all by herself, all the way to San Francisco, got a stagecoach, drove 3 days down from San Francisco to go by coach to San Juan, and then come back up to Santa Cruz and said, brother, I'm here to take care of you and you will be well. And he was. And she was an educated person, and part of why she came was because her other brothers who were here wrote and said, there's no one to teach school here in the Pajaro Valley, and we have all these kids. Now they're all different kinds, meaning different races, but they need a teacher. And so she felt that she had two missions. One was the education of the children of the Pajaro Valley and the healing of the sick, particularly her brother, who promptly got well and went off to, seek his fortune in Arizona. So the Cummings clan are all laced around the West, just like the Porters were.
But there was one Cumming who had a store in SoCal, across the street from the Porters.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was, I forgot which Cumming it was, but he was her brother. And then she had a sister that came too.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm in the midst of finding out more about Agnes. She wrote to Agnes and said, women of character and repute and education are in great demand here. And so Sister Agnes also came out, and John and Fanny introduced Agnes to Hiram Scott, who had befriended John in his youthful sorties up to the gold country, and who had also come down and invested in in a beautiful little property up in the mountains called Scotts Valley. So Agnes, Auntie Agnes, and Fanny were very, I would say, dominating characters in both of the lives of the two communities in which they lived.
So we have Agnes and Fanny, and Ben is still in SoCal, and George becomes a senator
Yes.
at some point. And then he goes to the San Fernando Valley. Is that correct?
Yes. George K. went to the San Fernando Valley, and I think he and Ben together bought the mission lands of the San Fernando Valley. Quite an investment, but in those days it's just land and nobody wants it. The reason that they didn't want it is there was no water.
Oh.
And there was a movie made about that. Very good movie. About Chinatown was the name of the movie.
Yes.
And I have no reason to think that that was fabricated story. But I thought it was quite fascinating because all the players are portrayed in that, and the importance of the LA Times and so forth.
I'm thinking around 1874, a number of things happened.
Oh, well, before that something happened. It was called the Civil War.
Well, that's true, and
The
that's
Civil
when John...
War was a big
Okay.
issue. So John was, there were only about 4 ports in California. Our coastline is not a hospitable place for shipping, except San Francisco, LA, and then you have the Wild Coast, and Monterey, the original. And the customs officer of Monterey was appointed by the president, Abraham Lincoln. And so maintaining control of the ports in California historically was an extremely significant and important thing for the Union to do. The southern part of the state was heavily Southern in their interests. And so the appointment of the customs officers was a way of ensuring that California gold would not fall into Southern hands. And there was a Southern ship, as I understand it, patrolling the Pacific here, trying to take gold cargo out to finance the cause.
So John is in...
So he was appointed as customs officer of Monterey, and he moved there with his new wife, and his little baby son.
Who was
was my grandfather.
Was your grandfather?
Was my
Was
grandfather.
Warren.
We're getting close.
Yeah.
And my great aunt, Florence, was born in the customs house in Monterey, the only American citizen born in the customs house. There had been, I'm sure, Spanish and Mexican children born there, babies, but she always held that as a great distinction.
Well, it was.
And I guess it was.
It was. Yeah.
But see, I knew none of these things till in high school I went on a field trip with my Spanish teacher to Monterey so we could learn more about our Spanish and Mexican roots and why it's a good thing to know Spanish and learn more about all of that to make us feel more settled here. And I went into the customs house, and at that time it was not restored as it is now to be a customs house, but it had these 2 pictures looming down looking very familiar, and it was my great-grandparents who were the last customs officers there, because after the Civil War, Monterey no longer had a big functional port. I mean, they had, the port had moved to San Francisco.
Well, now, just to move you a little closer to
Yeah.
Capitola for just a minute.
Sure.
John bought the Viejo property in Pajaro
Right.
and built the house, the big house,
Yes.
in around 1874.
Yeah. Well, there had been, and it still shows, there was still what became the kitchen, a wooden house that is absorbed as part of the big house.
So they're in the families moved to Pajaro.
Yeah.
And at that same year, John becomes a partner in a sugar beet mill in SoCal.
Yeah. And it was so successful, he went off and built more, developed more sugar beet growing down into the Salinas Valley. And the SP Railroad took advantage of that to raise their rates on the shipping of beets up here to the mill. So he was not making any money at that, so he just bought a right of way on down, a quarter of a mile to the west and built his own railroad from the Pajaro Valley, because John T. had signed up all these farmers and convinced them to give up whatever they were growing that they couldn't get shipped to. You had to have something like potatoes that you could ship to San Francisco. And they built a railroad down there. They built a railroad from their plant in Watsonville to the big plant in what we now know as the town of Spreckles, which was the biggest sugar plant ever built, I guess.
When was it, 1880s that John T. arranged to have Chinatown moved?
Well, that was an unfortunate chapter. When Fanny came to Watsonville to teach, she found that she said that she had 35 children in her class. There were a class of 15 of all the grades from 1 to 10 to 12, and they spoke 5 different languages. So this business of having bicultural education and everybody speaking a different language is nothing new, and they had to just learn English fast, because there were Italian kids, and there were Slavonian kids, and there were Chinese kids and Japanese kids, all these kids from different backgrounds, completely different languages. And there was a great anti-Chinese movement in this state. In fact, there were laws banning Chinese from coming here. It was a really significant period of discrimination, which our society should learn from when we're talking about how we're going to control immigration and the languages that people speak and their ethnicity. We've been through that all before, folks, and I hope we learn that it is not ever, it tried to be part of our history, but we have eviscerated that aspect of being an American. We always think it's once and for all, but it's something to which we have to keep very alert, I think. And I have certainly benefited from having friends of many different races, creeds, and colors. Nobody in my family ever told me who to have for a friend. My father's big lesson to me was, you choose your friends. Don't let anybody, your family or anybody else, you choose them, because you will either be benefited or you wish you hadn't. But you have to learn that. And as a result, I have this myriad of friendships that have been kaleidoscopic. Well, anyway, they chased the Chinese out of Santa Cruz and out of lovely Mid-County, and they all came to live in Watsonville. And then Watsonville decided that they were getting over too many Chinese in Watsonville. And my grandmother said, those are the best students I ever had in my classes. They were the smartest, they were the best behaved, and it is absolutely criminal that they're going to be kept from living somewhere with all those children who need educating. And my grandfather said, Fanny, if you think they're so great, you just invite them over to live next door. So she did. And she started what became the most flourishing Chinatown. I think Stockton and San Francisco were the only two Chinatowns larger than Watsonville in that period. And it was, and he said, and you rent them, it's your problem, you have to run the school, and if there's any problem with them, you have to take care of it, and you have to collect the rents, and she did all of that. There was definitely no problem. And she would ride her carriage. I'm sure she was a great fan of Queen Victoria. She had this affectation. She would ride down the main street of Chinatown on rent-paying day, and everybody came out and paid their rent. And she has a tally book, which is in the, I think we gave it to Sandy Lyden.
And I gave it to the Museum of Art and History.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, anyway, that kind of interested Sandy in his whole, in the whole story of the Asian community here in the
Yeah, it was a
Monterey
very
Bay.
important chapter.
Yeah,
Well, Fanny, being very sociable, and they both used the train to get through Santa Cruz County, and she appeared a number of times at the Cessna House.
oh yes,
So that's one little chapter I was hoping you could touch on before we
sure.
run out of time.
The fact that the train came through here at all was another kind of one of those opportunistic activities that the Porters were very shrewd about. The train was, it was assumed that the train would go through San Juan Bautista and down south from there, because the main roads went that way. Well, meanwhile, John T. and others, his colleagues, acquired the quarry. And meanwhile, they acquired what is now the Forest of Nicene Marks, the Loma Prieta Lumber Company. And meanwhile, they acquired ranches on the rights of way of the Southern Pacific Railroad. So I can't say there was collusion, but good friends seemed to do business better together.
Mm.
There was much more understanding. And so all the rock seemed to come from the quarry, and all the redwood was, and they built the railroad with those ties, with those Chinese laborers, and with that rock. And they built south, and as they built south, they had the redwood and the everything to build the next town, you know, to get on down to Chula or something.
So the railroad was something very familiar to the Porter family.
Yes.
And I know they had a lot of passes to go on all the trains.
Right. That was very impressive.
But I was sort of enchanted by Fanny's relationship with the Benjamin Porter family and the Cessnans.
Yeah,
You know.
well, that's because people mostly came here by train.
Mhm.
So it was not only because of their familial relationship and the roots in Soquel, which were very important to them, but also the people arrived on the train, and she would send her coach to the train to see who was coming in that might want to come to lunch, or the trains ran much more frequently, and then with passenger trains.
Well, I know too that Warren, when he was lieutenant governor of California, often his friends from Sacramento, and he would come down and then stay at Pajaro with Fanny
Right.
on the train.
So there was a lot of political connection, just because there weren't that many people in California. You know, at the time that California became a state, I think there were like 25,000 people in the whole state.
The last little bit in the Aptos SoCal area is this Cessna history, and you, I think, told me once that that was one of the things that you grew up not knowing much about, was
No.
that family.
Well, I didn't know. The only family that I really knew anything about was my Uncle John Porter and his 3 daughters, who I thought were the princesses of all time, because they were about 5 and 6 years or more older than I, too. And then one of them was 2 years older, Ruthie. So those are the people
But
I
you've
knew.
said now that when the Cessna Mansion became part of Cabrillo,
Yes, I became very interested.
and that's how you met your distant cousins that are now your good friends.
Oh, yes. We
So-
practically fell into each other, no, because they're non-demonstrative. But they're lovely, lovely, darling people.
So these are Ben's descendants
Yes.
that you did not know.
No, because of my father's feeling that he'd heard enough about porters, which I'm blathering on about. I found them interesting, and he found it more than he wanted to talk about.
You also, along with the Cessna descendants, helped Cabrillo save or restore
The
Cessna
Cessna
Mansion after the earthquake. Is that right?
Absolutely. Was the most fun project I've ever been involved with, and many other people too. It was not just the Cessna girls and myself, because the whole community around Aptos and Soquel, I think, realized that the architectural dignity of that place was something that would enhance the community, and the college thought of it just as a place to have some offices, and what are we going to do with all this space? Well, they had no place to gather people, so I felt very strongly that they should keep that lawn in the back, because they didn't have all these wonderful performance halls and everything. There was no place to have a gathering of the community, and they put up tents and have graduations and everything, and
now
they've
they have
kept
this
that.
beautiful
Yes.
building. You said you had a Capitola story. Do you remember?
Oh yes, this is very personal. When I was in about the 8th grade, war broke out. The second war, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and so everything kind of froze in time then. And it was very significant for all of us here, because suddenly the people who had been our neighbors and friends, the country that was their point of origin, we were at war with. So that was one whole issue. But also there was no place, you didn't go anywhere for vacations. There was no, tires were rationed, gas was rationed, so you stayed at home. This was at the time when, as a 14-year-old, you are sort of wanting to get out of town and have a little fun, and where everybody went for fun had been Capitola. And being old enough to go to Cap, as they called it, like my older cousins who went there dancing the night away at the Capitola ballroom, or to be even more sophisticated and go to Rio del Mar, or to be our era and go to the beach at Rio. I mean, that was my idea of the most exciting and socially upscale thing one could possibly do. I still like to ride my horse, but I had my sights far broader than that, thanks to this whole new idea of what society does, which is go to Capitola. And people from far and near came to Capitola to have a wonderful time.
Even during the war?
Because it was only from here to there. Oh, I could take the bus. I took the bus. Mary Rogers and I would take the bus, or others, and then we'd walk from down to the beach to Rio. It's a long walk, but it's worth it to be at the beach. And Cap was, Rio was nice, but because it was good, Uncle John would take you to Rio to go swimming, but to go to Cap was a social event. Well, one of my friends' grandmother had a cottage at Capitola up on the bluff, and she got to have a house party there. We all took sleeping bags. It was the slumber party era. And we all slumbered. Well, what a laugh, no slumbering that night. But there we went to Capitola, which was the farthest we could go as a group, you know, because nobody had enough gas points. And the next morning, we all went down into the village. And there beside the creek, Aptos Creek, was a rowboat with oars in it. A big mistake for anybody who has a rowboat to leave the oars in with somebody like me around. So I got in the boat and rowed it across the creek. And over on the other side, there was a just mass of vines and tangles. And there was a kind of a glittering, slightly glimmering window up in the midst of all the vines and up. And so I thought, well, I have to go investigate that. So I tied the boat up, got the painter. I mean, I wanted to get out if I needed to, so I had it. I knew how to tie for a quick being a cowgirl. You know how to, you want to get that thing loose. And went up through Poison Oak, and I went into this building with big stairway, magnificent stair. I mean, I had to go in through doors, and you know, I was sure I was going to meet not necessarily a monster, but probably our idea of the worst thing that could happen would be to meet a tramp.
Oh yeah.
To meet a tramp who would be just older and more wizened version of what I was as a little teenage lookabout. And so I went into this place, and it was very spooky, and it had vines hanging everywhere. It was the setting for a really big time horror movie. And then I thought, I think I've seen enough. So I backed on down, and everything seemed to be creaking and moving, and got in my little rowboat and rowed across the creek to all my little friends who said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're back. You know, you should have done that." And I said, "It was a snap. You just need to go ahead and do it if there's nothing over there. It's that there's a spooky old house, that's all."
You were in this spooky place.
Yes.
And you came out, and you were 14 or so.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, it became just really nice restaurant.
Oh, I'm thrilled with it.
Okay. So, did you ever go into the Shadowbrook and recognize it?
Oh, yes. Immediately.
So when you walked into Shadowbrook, you went, "This is the house that I
Because I went over.
snuck into."
Well, the reason that I recognized it is that I was asked to go down and see it from the
Oh, the creek.
creek side,
Uh-huh.
and to see the stairway,
Uh-huh.
and the stairway is still there.
So that must have felt really kind of strange to
Oh, it
realize.
felt wonderful. It was such a big experience for me as a young girl, and then to find it all validated, to have just felt this sense that I discovered this place.
Yes, and now it was this great restaurant.
Yes.
It's the oldest business in Capitola.
Oh, well, I was there before the oldest business. Another thing that I always loved in Capitola was the idea that my Uncle John, who was quite a swimmer and a beach goer, he would take us girls, my cousin Ruthie and myself, and anybody else that would fit in the car, down to Rio del Mar to go to the beach. And he'd get, in those days, people used those big parasols at the beach a lot. And he would leave us all there, and he and Lorraine Scott, Bert's wife, would go swimming. And they would swim to Capitola.
Oh my.
Swim and walk to Capitola from Rio and have a drink or two and come on back. By that time the day was over. The children, they had all the credit for taking the children to the beach, and they had all spent their time in Capitola, which had a little bit of a rep, you know, because of the dancing and dining that went on there, and also because I guess, like most coastal places in the Monterey Bay that were not totally inaccessible, there was a very heavy-duty activity going on all of that coast during Prohibition. There was no Prohibition in Capitola, I don't think.
A lot of people did not recognize.
No. Those rules did not apply. And I didn't know anything about what the rules were. The rules never applied in the Porter household. That was very, my family, that part of my family, always imbibed very generously.
I think I remember looking in Fanny Porter's diary when Prohibition started, and she said they delivered a big vat for storing wine, because you could have it for your own use, you know.
Yeah, but
and so I guess she ordered a big,
probably,
you know, so she could continue to serve guests.
Yes, well, one of the things that I noted in her diaries was that most of the trains that came through from San Francisco were met by her coachman, and anyone that was here who cared to and who particularly she knew they were coming, was invited to lunch. And I think that the museum has the book, her diary of who had lunch there every day. And it included people like Jane Stanford.
All the people that would come, they would meet the train.
They would meet the train and invite them to lunch.
You know, there's one chapter of your family history that was in Aptos, and I don't want to skip it.
Okay.
Tell me about the Prieta Lumber Company and Forsything Marks, and how you got involved in Forsything Marks.
Right. I was living in Connecticut, and I received a letter from a real estate agent in Salinas asking if I would be interested in selling my property as part of a gift that this family, the Marks family, was giving to the state park, to make a state park. And my Uncle John was born there. My Uncle John Porter, my uncle.
Is that John Easton?
John Easton.
Yeah.
And so I went up there to see it and thought, by then, the second growth had come along. My father said, the place is devastated, it's just a mess, you'd never be interested in it. Well, he had not been there for probably 10 or 15 years, and he didn't realize that redwoods regenerate.
Yeah.
Thank you. They are a great story for everybody who lives in that area. And so the redwoods had grown back to be at least the beginning of what we now know and enjoy as the Forest of Nicene Marks, and the lot which I was able to convince my various cousins, 6 of them and 1 of me, but I owned a third. So I know how to hold them. And I wanted that to be, to commemorate my grandmother and grandfather's life there, and how important that forest was to our family's fortune, and to bring the SP Railroad right up into the heart of things. And I also remember hearing about the fun that they used to have down in Aptos, which is where it ended, and about the interest in sending the logs on down to Capitola. If they couldn't get out by train, they could float things out to boats and haul them on boats. Soquel and Capitola have always been very integral to my family and its development, and the library.
That's a story we didn't tell.
I mean, I'd like to mention with great pride the fact that the Cessnon branch of the family was one of those that founded the library. It's called the Porter Library because that's who sponsored it. And it's always been very, I've been very proud of that they would think that one of the first things, just as I'm proud of my grandmother starting a first school that accepted children irrespective of their ethnic background. And the Chinese, one of their star graduates in Pajaro, who went on to be the first Chinese graduate of Stanford Med School. I just know that even in my era of going to school at Watsonville, I always felt very, very close to the Chinese students, because they're smart and they're fun, and they kind of have their act together. And the rest of the teenagers were, they're all over the place. And we had some very good basketball players who were Chinese, too. So it was, and who were very good athletes. So it isn't just because of their smarts, they're really good folk. And I think that we are engaged in a sort of questioning and suspicious role with China now, politically. And I think that we should search our own history and find out how much we owed them in the development of this state, and how badly they were treated. And think about that when we think about who we're making friends with and deciding are the bad guys. And my father's words are well taken. You just decide for yourself who you're going to have for your friends.
Well, that's...
And my friends, I've found that true is still alive. That attitude is still alive quite a bit in this part of the world, having lived in other parts of the world that are more ethnocentric.
This has been a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your memory and experience.
There's always more.
I know. It's a very full story, and we just touched on little parts of it, but it really is fascinating.
Well, I tried to keep the parts alive as I experienced them here. I've lived many places in the United States and traveled relatively broadly, and here I am, back as close as I can be to the most beautiful and finest place in the world, which is the Monterey Bay Area.
That's right, right here. Well, thank you.
Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore. Capitola, over the bridge we'll go. We'll capture the sunset glow and wait for the creek to flow. Capitola, sway to the ocean's roar. Beside the strand we'll hear the band down by the shore.